Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Nicole Makowski, and I'm part of GFLAC, the Climate Finance Group for Latin America and the Caribbean. And on behalf of GFLAC, Global Initiatives for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, GIESCR, and Argentina 1.5, all member organizations of the Latin American and Caribbean Network for the Sustainable Financial System, REDFIS, we welcome you to today's webinar titled Climate Finance in 2026, Challenges and Opportunities. Kindly note that today's webinar will be held in English, but we have simultaneous interpretation into Spanish, which you can activate through your Zoom toolbox. Por favor, noten que el webinar del día de hoy va a tener lugar en inglés, pero pueden activar la interpretación simultánea al español a través de su barra de tareas de Zoom. Also note that this webinar is being broadcasted live through GFLAG's YouTube channel, so you can check the recording of the webinar there afterwards, and we will be sharing that link through the chat soon. And today, for today's webinar, and while everyone is still joining, we will be addressing the outlook for climate finance toward 2026 through different processes that are extremely relevant in our views, such as the climate negotiations, development finance processes, debt dynamics, tax cooperation, and the international financial architecture reform. So in the next slide, thank you, you will see we have a very exciting lineup of panelists. So we have Rebecca Thiessen, the Global Advocacy Lead at Climate Action Network International, CANAI, Mariana Paoli, the Global Advocacy Lead at Christian Aid, Maya Kolodenko, in charge of global initiatives at Suramericana Vision, Magdalena Rochi Monagas, the Program Officer on Climate and Environmental Justice at GIESCR, Dileimi Orozco, an independent advisor on sustainable finance and economic governance, and Jose Fernandez Alonso, who is the coordinator of green and climate finance at Argentina 1.5. So each of the panelists will have approximately 7 minutes for their first interventions. And afterwards, we will have a segment of questions and answers with you, with the participants. So you can start leaving your comments, also your questions through the Q&A box, which is also in your Zoom taskbar. So first, and having done that introduction, let me welcome all of the panelists. We wanted to start first with what happened at COP30, that is the 30th Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So for that, we have Rebecca, who will start by unpacking the political landscape that shaped the discussions at COP30. So Rebecca, in your view, what were the main political dynamics at COP30, and how did they shape what happened, as well as what are your expectations for this year's discussions? Please go ahead, Rebecca.
Thanks, Nicole, and hi everyone. Good to be here and have this important discussion. So yeah, I'll structure my thoughts maybe in two parts. So one, answering your question of what was the political context of COP. Obviously, it seems like a life ago, but it was not that long. So I'll try to bring you back to the context of the COP, and then potentially thinking a bit ahead and what it would mean for 2026, while my colleague Mariana will go a bit deeper into the specific outcomes that we got at COP and what type of work is needed along the way. So in terms of the context of COP30 that happened in Belém in November, I think one thing that was really clear is the tense geopolitical context that the world was facing and is still definitely facing. And so countries' priorities were definitely elsewhere than on climate action. So, there was a lot of pressure for countries to submit their new NDCs. And we know that in the end, when we reach Brazil, very little country, did actually do the homework, but that was actually a reality for many other things that were supposed to be, at the forefront. And in the end, climate appeared to be deprioritized in the context of trade wars, rising conflicts, retreat of international cooperation. So it was a very difficult context to have this kind of a multilateral conversation for 2 weeks that, I remind everyone, is based on consensus, right? In terms of the finance discussion, I think it was also really clear that COP30 was the prolongation of the so-called Baku hangover. So the results we got at COP29 in Baku in 2024 were influencing everything that were discussed in the rooms in Belém. In terms of concretely the impact it has in every negotiating rooms. So the finance discussion was kind of inviting itself in the adaptation room, in the just transition room, around the mitigation discussion on the phasing out for fossil fuel, for example. So it was very tangible, even if it was not a finance COP. We had a lot of finance ghosts, so to say. But the other thing that was also really clear in terms of continuing on the Baku journey was the playbook of developed countries, right? It appeared really clearly when we arrived in Belém that Global North countries were not willing to put any more money on the table. Rather, they were there with a clear mission to bring new contributors in, to crowd in more private sector and debt-inducing instruments, and to make sure that the responsibilities were minimized as much as possible. So that was very clear, for many years, and it kind of appeared at its peak in Baku. But the consequences of that continued in Belém. So the COP presidency did the best they could, I think, in kind of mixing the formality with the informality in a very Brazilian style. So sometimes pushing it to its limit by creating kind of new processes within the processes, and doing this kind of shuttle diplomacy in a very G20 way in the COP. But that gave us, some type of result that will obviously, at least in my view, not the best, but maybe that's the only thing we could really land on, looking at the current context I just alluded to. One thing I want really to quickly flag, and then I'll go to the outlook for 2026, is the just transition piece that got totally, I think, overlooked by mainstream media and maybe the average civil society. But it's a win first. But it's also a finance win. I think that's something that's really important for us to look at. Maybe it was a win because nobody looked at it. That's maybe sometimes how we win, by not picking the most contentious battles. But this text, the Just Transition Work Program decision, has really strong qualitative finance elements that I think are important for work moving forward. So just briefly then, what does this all mean for 2026? So obviously the geopolitical storm is likely to continue. I mean, just look, Greenland, Iran, Venezuela. It's really clear that we are not, landing anywhere calmer in the last weeks and upcoming months. But there is also maybe a potential reshuffle in alliances and blocks that we need to watch. Obviously, always asking ourselves how fair those would be and which interest, but I think this is something that we need to watch, and that would have an influence on the climate discussion. I think there is a bigger question about the global order, as we see it now, entering a clear age of impunity. Obviously, I mean, the US imperialistic approach has been there for decades, right? But it's now cruder and clearer than ever. So what does it mean in terms of international cooperation, where we see countries aiming more and more for self-interest partnerships and shifting from an aid model to an investment model, which implicates a lot of new actors, new instruments. So I think that also has to be factored in our reflection and strategies, because we are not in the same space we were in recent years, or at least we have accelerated that shift. This happening obviously in the context of a very heavy debt crisis hitting the global south. So with debt payment reaching potentially highest level in 2026, as well as a very high cost of capital, right? Increasing inequalities within a region, but also between region. And so my last one would be, I think in all those conversations, it's really important to remember that development and climate finance are deeply intertwined in the reality on the ground. So we also have to think about how we keep the climate agenda and the climate finance conversation relevant for the global south, right? So not only looking at the niche that we focus often on about the UNFCCC, but connecting that to the wider financial architecture and the economic system would be a key to make sure we move forward. So I'll stop here, Nicole. Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I think it's quite interesting to hear about this concept of reshuffling the traditional alliances. We know that we are in a very complex context, and I'm sure the other panelists will touch on this further. But you also mentioned that this was not a finance COP. As you probably know, COP29 was known as a finance COP because we adopted a new goal regarding climate finance. However, there were several outcomes regarding climate finance, and we have Mariana now to lead us through those. So Mariana, maybe you can take us through, what were the key climate finance outcomes emerging from COP30? And, how do they set the expectations and priorities toward 2026? Please go ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Nicole, and hello, everyone. You probably post-COP might have had been part of different conversations about the outcomes, but as we look at them again through fresh eyes in terms of what it means for our work moving forward and what are the real milestones that we can take forward in our joint advocacy and campaigning. And perhaps just going back in terms of how that Baku outcomes have really hunted the COP, meaning that the biggest effort last year was really about securing a space to continue the conversation on climate finance from public sources, the quality of finance. So, and that's why in Bonn, we had the G77 and a number of countries calling for an agenda item on Article 9.1 to discuss the provision of finance. And of course, as a result of the COP, we had Global North countries especially calling for the discussion on the whole Article 9, which means also including discussions around the NCQG, and that's pretty much what we got as perhaps the main entry point is this a 2-year work program on climate finance on Article 9. So is that a risk or is that an opportunity? How can we really set the priorities of how this Article 9 work program should look like? What are maybe the 2 key things we have to really push forward to make a needle to have the right space and effort to bring the public provision discussion back to the core of the kind of climate finance you want to be delivered underneath the NCQG? Perhaps this is one of the key ones to pick up. The second one, of course, there is this high-level ministerial roundtable on NCQG implementation, but I guess this is still to be seen what impact, who's going to be there, what's going to be the agendas. And on the same vein, we have also seen more discussions and dialogues being set up. For example, when we look at the we had last year the conclusion of the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue on Article 2.1c in terms of aligning financial flows with fossil fuels, phase out the goals of the Paris Agreement. And again, what we got out of it was more dialogues. There is the Veredas dialogue and also the Xingu finance talks on practical solutions with high-level roundtables, likely at least until November 2028. So yet it's another entry point, but what it means in practice is really still to be seen. I think it was touched before, but we also had one of the outcomes that was celebrated by a few, but criticized by many because it's quite weak, was the tripling of adaptation finance. And we know how weak that outcome was because that tripling only needs to be reached by 2035. There is no baseline with what exactly we are tripling. And it's not just about public finance, but it's also from all sources. And we know how much it's public finance is essential for adaptation, especially given only 3% is coming from private sources. And then, as Rebecca was mentioning, the win that we got in terms of the Just Transition Work Program, the adoption of the Belém action mechanism, what will be the finance elements of that we could be taking forward? It's another avenue for us to look into. Some more challenging ones, we know we spend quite a bit of time focusing on the Baku to Belém roadmap throughout the year, last year, but actually in terms of the COP outcomes, it was only noted. So the political appetite to transform that into something more meaningful is lacking. And we know that within the roadmap, there were a number of problematic solutions as well. But there is one point perhaps which we need to look more in detail, which is the Article 16 of the NCQG, which is looking at the multilateral funds. We know very little was pledged to the Adaptation Fund, for example, only 135 million, and very little non-existent for the others. But if the NCQG would be really to concretize, tripling the amount of funds, of those funds by 2030, the Adaptation Fund, the GCF, etc., would be one of the first tests for moving forward. So I think there are some of those questions about what we can do now, this year, and maybe the following one, to build up for the momentums for the bigger moments on the finance agenda, which will be 2028. That's when actually we have the first stock taking on NCQG implementation, we have the GST2, and actually a number of other more technical reports we need to be prepared for that year, the Standing Committee on Finance, that we should look into working a bit more. Of course, in COP30, there was also the action agenda with a number of voluntary actions coming out of that. So the Global Implementation Accelerator, for example, in terms of how to support NDC's implementation, and the NAPS was one in terms of and then the Belém Mission to 1.5, again, another action-oriented platform under the Troika to increase international cooperation. But again, this is all more in the voluntary initiatives. And to some extent, it remains to be seen if the conversation on fossil fuel phase out, the roadmap, the TAF, the Santa Marta conference in Colombia, to what extent the finance needed for just transition will be part of that conversation, and what does it mean for work moving forward. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say, I think we have to be very strategic on how do we use this Article 9 work program. We have to look into the long-term influencing for 2028, and really looking at our strategies, recentering the role of public finance, because the false finance solutions, private sector first approaches are mainstreamed out there. And lastly, connecting the dots between the conversations on climate finance under COP30, under the UNFCCC, with other global processes, global architecture reform, debt and climate and tax will be very important moving forward. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariana. So you give me the perfect opening with your ending, saying, we need to connect the dots, and also in the different, in the main outcomes in terms of climate finance that you were speaking about. I think we've seen an improvement, if you will, when it comes to the discussions on the quality of finance, and that usually, at least in the UNFCCC, implies talking about non-debt generating instruments, as well as other issues. But last year, we had a very important event, which was the FFD4, that is the fourth International Conference on Financing for Development, which took place in Spain, in Sevilla. And there was a commitment there, which establishes a series of, let's say, follow-up steps for this year. But also there were some, key inclusions in that commitment regarding debt sustainability. So for that, we now have Maya. Maya, so again, what do you see as the key follow-up milestones under the Seville commitment this year? And, how did the Seville commitment actually address that sustainability, of course, affecting climate finance? And what are, your expectations for this year?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for bringing this very interesting topic, in particular in this challenging and geopolitical moment that we're facing. But regardless, we need to still talk and try to move forward with the commitments and with all, well, just keeping alive a sort of multilateralism that remains. So just briefly about the Seville commitment and why it matters. First, the Seville commitment and the Compromiso de Sevilla emerged in a time when climate finance gaps are large, remain large. There are some quality issues, as my previous speaker mentioned, and also debt in developing economies is mounting. Is still an issue for many countries, because the debt situation in many countries is crowding out spending, like paying services, debt services, and capital on the debt is crowding out spending in important development finance that is not being taken care, and it's affecting the people's lives. Actually, it has a really impact in the citizens' lives. So, but of course, this conversation that we're doing today is finding these links, right, about the climate finance, and we cannot discuss climate finance in isolation. We need to linked with other development finance needs, and it's deeply related with the debt dynamics and tax cooperation, that is my following speaker, and the financial architecture reform. So another takeaway that we can take from Seville also is, this notion that if we don't address these constraints, these finance constraints, special debt and the fiscal space, these climate finance commitments are risking, and that the commitments that are made, if we don't address the debt situation, this commitment, climate finance commitments could remain largely aspirational, right? So there are different debt initiatives in the Seville Compromise. But let me briefly talk about the debt situation, the current debt situation, because as I said in the beginning, that debt remains one of the most binding constraints that are shaping the implementation of this commitment. Recently, at the end of the 2025, the World Bank has published a very interesting document about the debt situation, the international this debt report that they always, like, it's a regular report, but this year it has an interesting takeaway that I can tell you, is that developing economies paid out 741 billion more in principal and interest on their external debt, more than they received in new financing between 2022 and 2024. So this is the largest gap in at least 50 years. This means that in a context when also low-cost financing has become harder to obtain, except from multilateral organizations, so this remains a constraint, because developing economies are not receiving more financing, a low-cost financing. They are paying more on service on debt than what are they receiving. So this has a lot of implications for climate finance, for development finance as a whole. Also, current debt restructuring and relief mechanism remains low, fragmented, insufficiently aligned with climate and development objectives. And so without this progress on debt sustainability, the implementation of Seville commitment will remain limited. So there were different initiatives related to debt at the FFT4. Let me talk briefly about some of them. There is this Sevilla Forum on Debt and the Borrowers Forum. The Borrowers Forum. I want to zoom in briefly on this initiative that emerged from Seville commitment, because there are a lot of. It is very important. It became very noteworthy, the importance of borrowers, in particular in this context, in this geopolitical context, to be able to coordinate more in different settings already. But if UNCTAD is currently working on an institutional framing and leading different countries, providing a platform for debtor countries to exchange technical experiences, increase collective leverage, and advocate for sustainable debt solutions. So progress on debt borrower forum and coordination among borrowers could be a promising outcome from Seville, including, of course, they will coordinate in different topics relating to debt, but development finance and climate finance could be part at some point of this coordination between them. And so I think this could be another step and something that we need to remain focused on and support and look at the progress of the Borrowers Forum. So there was also a debt post-close alliance that it was a coalition led by Spain, France, Canada, and the UK, and other multilateral development banks committed to embedding clauses that allow for the suspension of debt payments during natural disasters or economic crisis. So this is an interesting alliance to look at from the climate perspective. And there was this global hub for debt swaps for development. So this is something that was established by Spain and the World Bank to provide more technical support and scale up debt for development swaps. So this is an interesting initiative. So despite all these steps and this mechanism, these initiatives that emerge from Seville related to debt and to the development finance, and to try to improve at some point the international financial architecture, there are certain still concerned that these are not still enough, and these are initiatives that are also slow moving, and of course in this particular challenging context, perhaps the outcomes will be harder to note in the short term. So then there are a lot of things to be done. We need to still look out and provide accountability for the Seville commitment. These are interesting initiatives. These are the reflections from the diagnostics also are very important to take care of, and we have a responsibility to make these initiatives accountable. So there are choices that we need to make from now, starting now. So I think 2026 will be a key year, because we'll need to start implementing the framework and look for the accountability. So this year will determine how these initiatives will become a meaningful lever of change, or if not, they could become a missing opportunity. But hopefully we can achieve something together and look for these changes. But as I say, there are meaningful initiatives over there. So we need to keep track of on some of them in particular, and see how they evolve.
Thank you, Maya. I think it's quite interesting noting that many of these initiatives you were mentioning are actually country-led initiatives. So I think, especially from civil society, we need to keep track of what countries are actually doing, not only this year but in the following ones regarding debt. You mentioned the debt crisis that is quite worrisome in global South countries. And also there will be a series of meetings that were established by the civil commitment. So you were mentioning the Forum on Financing for Development, but there will also be some special meetings held by the ECOSOC of the UN. So we have a special meeting on credit rating agencies, but also on financial integrity. So those of you who are, more interested in the debt discussions, I think this is also useful. But in parallel of, the issue of debt, we have the tax discussions. And this is something we also saw, gaining visibility last year with the beginning of the negotiations of the UN Tax Convention. So Magdalena, Maggie will take us or will update us on the status of the negotiations of this UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. And Maggie, we wanted to know what are the key issues currently under negotiation in the UN Tax Convention. What should we be watching for this year, and why do these issues matter for climate finance and human rights as well?
Thank you, Nikki, for inviting me and everyone for their incredible presentation so far. I think something that we have seen so far as a key message is that we have to be looking within the UNFCCC, but also beyond, and be aware of the reform of the international financial architecture. And as Nikki has mentioned, in the last years, we have seen a process that has arisen, which is the negotiation of the UN Tax Convention. This started in 2023 with General Assembly resolution, and we have since then been starting to negotiate the text of that convention, that framework convention, and additionally to additional protocols that have so far been negotiated in the headquarters of the UN in New York, but also just as we were at COP last year in Belém, there was also a negotiation taking place in Nairobi. So throughout last year, we have seen the negotiation of the UN Tax Convention that is continuing this year and will continue all the way to 2027. In a couple of days from 3 February, we are going to have a new session of negotiation in New York, where different states, of course, with their representatives, are going to be getting on the details of the text of the Framework Convention and the additional protocols. And the truth of why tax cooperation matters for climate financing is because it's the other side of the coin. Fiscal reform addresses climate finance because it can be a source of sustainable, structural, predictable, non-debt creating financing, and because the numbers are very decisive in this sense. According to the calculations of Tax Justice Network, if we address global tax abuse, there is a potential of $492 billion every year that could be recovered annually from global tax abuse. So we see that addressing evasion, illusion, illicit financial flows can significantly help to cover the climate financing gap. And of course, in the last couple of years, we have seen the NCQG, this last COP, the adaptation goal that have been clearly a drop in the ocean of what is really needed to address the climate emergency, to finance just transitions. And evidently also, we necessarily need to talk about public financing. And in order to do so, we also have to be resourceful as to where we can find those resources and identify the processes that can help us get to the actual amounts that we need. And so, of course, we understand that the UN Tax Convention, it is definitely a process that matters very much from a climate financing perspective. It would be the first legally binding global tax instrument under the UN auspices. And it fundamentally is shifting the balance of power, because so far we have had tax cooperation taking place within the OECD, and it would take away that tax cooperation towards the UN, moving it from a club of wealthy nations towards a universal platform that so far has explicitly started to integrate human rights as a guiding principle for tax cooperation. That was one of the key achievements so far, that human rights was included in the terms of reference of the convention. Also, right now, we have within the text of the Framework Convention, particularly in Article 4, one of the guiding principles of tax cooperation would be sustainable development. And those are the things that are continuing to take place through 2026, and of course, as well, all the way to 2027, when the text of the convention would be adopted. And I think the message here is that we have to be very present in those negotiations, that civil society has to be aware and follow up on what is going on, but also be present, if possible, in the negotiations, because what is happening, of course, is that we are seeing the same level of division that we have seen in the COP last year, where developed nations are trying to water down the commitments within the UN Tax Convention. And that is what is at stake, whether the Framework Convention would actually establish an explicit framework to address global tax abuse, or whether it will be watered down through the upcoming sessions of the negotiation of the text. And in particular, when it comes to Article 4, which is the one that guides tax cooperation as something that has to lead to sustainable development, that is one of the key messages or key articles that we need to fight to retain, and maybe even better. So that is what is happening so far. In these weeks, as I mentioned, February 3rd, we have a new session that is starting in New York. And not only be present in the negotiations and participate in the UN Tax Convention, but also we have to do that back and forth within the UNFCCC to also bring matters related to tax cooperation into the discussions within climate forums, because that is, as I said, two sides of the same coin. So potentially, Mariana was mentioning the work program on Article 9 and the different spaces where this is being discussed. I think we have to be very aware of those spaces. We have to lead our view on public finance. And of course, tax cooperation has the potential to gather the resources needed for just transitions to enable just transitions on the ground. So in these 2 years that we still have for negotiations of the UN Tax Convention, and also operationalizing, for instance, the work program on Article 9, it is very important to keep these two sides of the coin very aware, both within and beyond the UNFCCC, to be able to actually gather the resources that are needed to address the climate finance gap. And I leave it at that. I know that my colleagues are going to keep talking about the broader reforms of the financial architecture system, and I welcome any questions that may arise on this process.
Thank you, Magdalena. I think, what we look to with this webinar is kind of connecting these different processes, and we've seen that this has been happening to an extent in the climate negotiations, but we still need a lot of work to do. And I just wanted to mention that Redfish recently submitted some inputs for a report that the UN Secretary General will be publishing this year on human rights and climate finance. So we can share those inputs with you through the chat. Take a look at them because I think, again, we need to push for the visibility of these links in different spaces. Having said this, we will now turn into the international financial architecture reform. There are many issues that, are part of these discussions. We've been addressing debt, we've been addressing tax cooperation, But one of the main fora where these conversations take place is the G20. We saw last year, we had South Africa as the presidency, and now the United States has the presidency this year. So we are kind of in an end of a cycle kind of era because of what's been going on with the United States. But let me give the floor to Delaney. So just to know, what kind of progress was made in the G20 last year regarding the international financial architecture reform, and what are, again, your perspectives for this year, which is a very difficult one. So, Dile?
Thank you, Nicole. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. And yeah, it's very, there is uncertainty at all levels when it comes to the financial architecture reform. But I think if we step back, because I think we also need to look at how much has been achieved over the last few years, right? We can go into this downward spiral and feeling like everything's been lost. But I think it's been very interesting that the G20 is culminating, like it's going into its second cycle of presidencies. And over the past 4 years, we have had a very distinct phase in its evolution. We have a succession of the Global South presidencies, with Indonesia, India, Brazil, and the latest one with South Africa. All of them place international financial architecture reform at the center of the agenda rather than at its margins. And I should say also that Italy was the one that also initiated that with the capital adequacy framework. Basically, in other words, it's just how the MDBs are approaching risk when it comes to lending to its members. So I guess the matter around the reform agenda hasn't been solved, and although this is an issue, what is interesting about the G20 is that it has considered this discussion to be legitimate, right? It has legitimized the idea that we need to start discussing this. It sort of came off to the consensus that we know what the problem is and how to move forward. So I think there are different things that I would say that this cycle have achieved. The 3 shifts, in my opinion, I'm sure there are many others that stand out. The first one, this issue, like I said, are no longer treated as peripheral. The MDB reform, the vertical climate funds evolution, those were issues that weren't discussed before at this level. Bringing climate not just an add-on, but as being part, creating task forces, bringing what was before niche development concerns into the discussion at the G20. I think that's a progress that we haven't seen in other presidencies, and it's basically normalizing that these are systemic challenges that the economies, the global system needs to deal with. The second element is that climate was consistently framed throughout all the presidencies as a development and fiscal issue. You look at the focus on adaptation, energy access, financing for transition, rather than only around emissions or regulation, which are the 2 elements that initially was mostly the focus of the G20. And the third one was around inclusion, and obviously there is more that needs to be done, but the fact that we have also the African Union becoming a permanent G20 member, thus signaling like an expansion of the G20. So yeah, we didn't see a transformation or delivering the transformation that we all wanted to see, but it has delivered continuity. It has delivered consensus on what matters at a systemic level, and continuity is rare when it comes to presidencies. Although it doesn't matter in different venues. So I think that's something I wanted to highlight in terms of what the cycle has achieved so far. Obviously, the G20 has some constraints, right? And the cycle, to some extent, has exposed its structural limits. It's definitely not an implementing body. It catalyzes consensus, but delivery happens in other institutions, like the IMF, the World Bank, the regional MDBs, the vertical climate funds, the regulators at the national level. So national policy also matters. So I think we can look at the G20 as, it has been described to some extent as a talk shop, and I can see that that's a valid reflection. But I think the real question, and what I see where there is value so far, is that whether this space generates enough political alignment for others to act. And I think if we look at some of the progress that have been done with the MDB's reform, that, you know, it now is estimated around the MDBs have the ability to unlock 600 billion over the next decade. That's not something that, and that was one of the recommendations of the first independent report that was done under the G20 Italian presidency. Now there is certainty that's going to be able to happen. The key question is how the MDBs are going to be delivering in a different way, how access is going to be improved. So there is still a question that hasn't been answered. But just wanted to show how the focus over the last few years on holding accountable the MDBs, pushing management, engaging the shareholders, taking them to the G20 to report back has been interesting in this, how this has a shift the needle if we want to, on certain areas. Of course, when you look at debt, I think Maya covered very well, there are still many issues taking place. At the same time, last year, we had the cost of capital for the first time being discussed. The G20 thinking about recognizing this as a systemic challenge. Now the key thing is who is acting on this. So I think last year what was interesting, I think this is going to be relevant for this year, is that Johannesburg made the constraints impossible to ignore, right? The absence of the United States meant that there was adoption of a communique without a declaration, without unanimity, and the visible strain in negotiations all signal a firm operating under geopolitical stress. And this is something, if you look at the review of the G20, the final report that was done on the G20 South African presidency, they are very clear. They recognize that the members recognize that the effectiveness of this venue has been declining. And they're taking a step back, recommending that they need to look at the zoom out and start looking at what was relevant. Should they go back to the core focus, how to minimize all the overlaps across the working groups? I mean, now they have more than 30 working groups and engagement groups as well. So it's becoming quite complicated to keep track of everything. But I just wanted to bring us to 2026. So obviously in the incoming US presidency, their priorities are quite clear, to be honest. There are three of them. They're focused on growth, the regulation, and energy security. There is no emphasis on climate, inequality, nor development. I do think there's some, contraction in terms of having a more leaner G20 is not problematic, and that's a priority for them. But there is a difference between having a focused G20 and a hollowed out one. And I think that's the risk that we might see with the US. I don't think we will see with the US in terms of a leaner agenda might abandon the institutional memory. We're already seeing that, and any shared commitment risk turning coordination into further fragmentation. I think the difficulty here for the reform agenda is that rather than bringing all the pieces together into trying to follow that, trying to hold accountable some of the institutions, even if this space is definitely not representative of all the voices, has the power to still push further to some of the international financial institutions. Without that, there is the rest we see the reform agenda slowing down. So the monitoring is going to be important, holding them accountable from independent, from civil society will be extremely relevant, and the engagement with them to sustain that would be really important. So I think, I guess we are at the end of a cycle, right? On one hand, the Global South presidencies did not resolve all the international financial architecture reform. That wasn't something they achieved, but they definitely reset the baseline for what can no longer be ignored. And I think we shouldn't forget that, and we should value it, especially in this current context, because there's a lot of commonalities on why smaller groups should be continuing discussing this. This question, I guess, for 2026 is whether the G20 or some of his members will be able to preserve some coherence and to remain potentially and be picked up in 2027 as a meaningful place where some of these reforms can still be shaped. I think the other element is whether this presidency, and when it comes to some elements of the international financial architecture reform, also be perceived having, benign neglect might not be bad. So I think we also need to think about, have a bit more a wait and see approach, in my view, in terms of what could happen. As when you look at their website, it's pretty clear that according to them, the best has yet to come. I don't know what that means, but I think there are two things that I want to leave you with. Is on one hand, a lot of things have been achieved. There's more things to do, but I think there is the importance here is, one, how do we sustain the focus on some of the institutions? How do we sustain the coherence across the financial architecture? And lastly, sustain the confidence across other members of the G20 countries that after this, they need to pick up the baton and go back to where the first cycle ended. Over to you, Nicole.
Thank you, Dilemi. And I think it's quite clear from what you were saying that there's a very, strong risk of fragmentation, of further fragmentation, given the road the US is taking, particularly regarding the G20. But we also wanted Jose to come in on this because there are different, policies being taken by the US that are kind of shaping the prospects for the international financial architecture reform. And we wanted to know, from your perspective, how this links to climate finance. Jose?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Nicole, and thanks for the presentations of the previous colleagues that were very interesting. And I think they are very coherent with of which I want to share this day. First of all, I think that some decisions made by the United States domestically will affect climate finance towards in this year, because they affected different dimensions of climate finance. First of all, I'd like to talk about the decisions regarding interest rates of reference. As you may know, last year in December, the Federal Reserve reduced its interest rate of reference, and nowadays it's 3.75, the rate of reference, which is the lowest rate of interest rates of reference from 2022. Even though there are some doubts about the continuity of this trend in this year because of the events that we acknowledged during last month and last weeks, and there are some warnings about the inflation there, and if the Federal Reserve will reverse its this decision in the next meetings. Even though we must recognize that there are several tensions and a strong tension between the president of this Federal Reserve and the Trump administration, and nowadays there are some events that presume that the president will be removed the next month. The other thing that I would like to stress is the continuity of the reshaping of the industrial policy of the Trump administration. As you may know, there were very differences between the Trump administrations and the previous one regarding the industrial policy. And in this industrial policy, we could consider, of course, the energy policy, because Trump administration has reinforced the relevance of fuel energy, and has promoted critical sectors that consume energy as AA. This new industrial policy reflect the limits of grids, and it is presumable that the Trump administration will foster some investments in the renewal of grids. And the other thing that I would like to stress is some points that were stressed previously. The intentions of the reshaping of the international orders and the financial institutions in this new order with new alignments. In this issue, it will be very important which consensus will be taken under the G20, and specifically in the reforms that were talked during the previous presidencies. In this regard, we must consider finally the geopolitical tension between US and China in the global order, but in the energy strategies, policies. And if the United States will forge more allies in this new imprint of non-renewables energies.
Thank you, Jose. I think you gave us kind of a bigger picture of some policies that the US is carrying out and their impacts. So as you've heard, these different processes are closely interlinked, and I think we need to keep pushing, as I mentioned before, for these different discussions, to be present in their spaces. But we've had some questions coming through the Q&A box, but also I see that some of you are putting questions in the chat. So if you want to do so, you can. And there are, again, several questions, but we'll start with one regarding the TFFF, which is the Tropical Forests Forest Facility. This is a fund that was launched by Brazil during COP30, and that it was, in my opinion, quite visible. There is a question regarding the actual participation of indigenous peoples in that fund, and what are your views on it? So I think, Mariana, maybe you can answer this one.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Nicole, and thanks for the question. We all know how much finance for forests is important, and how much direct access is really key for indigenous communities. From this sense, it's really important to have a fund conceived on this way. However, when we think about the model of the TFFF, it's not really free money. The way the fund will create resources, which then only 20% of the profits would go to the indigenous communities. It is about the debt that the Global South will be repaying back to investors. Because the way the fund works is that it is really ensuring profits for lenders, and that's the role of the role that governments can play within that. And then within those profits on the debt from the Global South, then 20% of that would go to indigenous communities. So it's actually another form of extraction, a new colonial way for the Global South to be further explored. So, and on top of that, the amount of money that the governments need to put towards that fund, it could be counted as climate finance. So it's another way to really use limited resources that could go for the public finance. It could go for adaptation, loss and damage, and a number of other climate activities that could be counted towards that. So yeah, while I do think it's really important to have public finance to deal with forests as much as climate, that mechanism is not really the right way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. And I think that also linked to this question, there's another one regarding, in a context of geopolitical tensions and limited fiscal, cooperation, what specific mechanisms can improve the quality of climate finance? So in other words, what opportunities exist to make financing more predictable, accessible, and aligned with human rights and climate justice? So I think maybe Rebecca, if you want to come in on this one.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. I think it's a very relevant one. So I think there are different ways to look at it, and we probably need to have a multifold approach when it comes to the quality of climate finance. One aspect of it is obviously the UNESCCC, and so we've been discussing about it. There are different tools and processes that exist and that we really need to invest as civil society to make sure we made the best use of it in terms of transparency, in accountability. So one concrete example, as Mariana said earlier, so we have this big reporting year in 2028, where we're going to assess where we are in the implementation of the new climate finance goal. So it would be really important to make sure that those reports actually really go in details in terms of what type of instruments, what type of actors, what type of finance is actually delivered to the developing countries. So, not just having those kind of big political conversations that are obviously important, but also having the technical information and data to back that up, right? So that's, I think, an important effort that we need to do collectively, not just, fighting for more and bigger numbers, but actually also making sure that we are aware and awake to the reality of the climate finance we're actually fighting for. And then, as many other panelists said, is of course all the different instruments, elements, actors that are happening outside of the COP bubble. Because if you look at it, and if you think about climate finance in a more holistic way, the COP conversation are actually a very tiny niche, right? Compared to the finance flows that are moving every day, and that, right? Whether it's resilience building, energy, infrastructure, all of that are actually much more concrete and palatable for developing countries' economies. So there is a question that Magdalena touched upon, as well as Maya, the question of, I think, debts and tax are essential pillars to make sure that qualitative finance and increased fiscal space is actually achievable for developing countries. And there, I think there is also a lot of, it's important to contextualize the solution we put in front of the reality of the countries we are trying to help and to advocate for. So I think there are big rules that needs to change at the international level, and we heard about them, coming from the FFD4, from the UN Tax Convention. But then there is also a lot of things to do and to advocate for at the national level to also change the rules from within. So I think it's always kind of a zoom in, zoom out strategy that's very important. And the two last other bits that I think are less present in our discussion, one is the whole conversation about green industrial policies and what that would mean moving forward, because the question of trade, technology transfer are taking more and more center stage, in particular in the current geopolitical context, right? And I think we also need to understand the of those discussions. And the last piece is the question of the cost of capital. Obviously very linked to the debt question, but I think that was also something very palatable coming out from the FFD discussion, and it has an immense impact on whether or not countries, in particular in the global south, can achieve their climate objective, right? So I think that's also something we probably need to consider much more and connect across different spaces.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I think you kind of answered one of the questions that said, what specific decisions from COP30 and the Seville commitment, the FFD4, could translate into debt relief or greater fiscal space for countries in the global south to invest in climate action in 2026. But I would also like to hear about this from Maya, if you have, any other, initiatives you think we should be paying more attention when it comes to debt relief.
Well, thank you very much. Well, this is an important question, right? And it's important because at the end of the day, for governments, in particular for developing countries, and in particular mostly for the vulnerable countries, it's a decision, right? How to allocate like the spending if between the debt, interest payments, or development finance, climate finance, adaptation, that there are long-term investment, and whereas the investments, the cost of capital remains high, this will remain also difficult, very difficult challenges. One action that I don't know I didn't mention something that was published in parallel like was done like an initiative in parallel from Seville. It like linked and had many conversation about the Jubilee report. That was something that was promoted by late Pope Francis, and last year we have like Professor Stiglitz and some commissioners published this Jubilee report. Why I mention this is because there is something interesting that could add to all these Sevilla conversations, and that of course the idea is achieving the sustainability, and I mentioned the debtors coordination, debtor forum, platform for debtors engagement, and debt sustainability, that like initiatives for debt relief are, but one thing that we should be keeping in mind is that of course countries are not defaulting on their debt, are defaulting on the development, because their countries are still paying these debts. As I mentioned, this is a choice. And actually what is happening, and that's the reference that I gave about these countries receiving less finance that they are providing. Like, so developing economies are paying more, like transferring more to different, like to creditors that are receiving in finance. So this means that we are bailing out creditors. So private creditors are getting the most of it. So we need to change this notion. And what I don't want to say is that we don't need to countries start defaulting on the debts either. There should be a safe space without a stigma and a good mechanism for countries to be able to restructure debt or to be able to roll over some of this financing and make a more meaningful choice between paying debt or still bailing out creditors that are getting most of it, instead of their own population that are receiving less investment in health, less education, less infrastructure investment on adaptation or different important spending. So we need to be mindful of the need to have mechanisms for debt restructuring mechanisms, in particular multilateral debt restructuring mechanisms, to avoid and ensure that there is this no bailout rule, in particular international financial institutions. So if like the World Bank and the IMF should still be lending, in part, like could be lending to countries, but not to pay out creditors. This should be this lending from multilateral organization, international financial institutions, should be directed to the needs of the population first. So this is something that I wanted to flag. And sorry, why I mentioned the Jubilee report, but because this also is, this conversation is also, and I encourage you to read it because it's also there in that report.
Thank you, Maya. And the Jubilee report is extremely useful, at least in my opinion. So I also encourage you to take a look if you can. It's available online. But there's also a question, I think there's a clarification question for Magdalena regarding a global tax. So how is paying this global tax? I think this is related to something you mentioned in your intervention.
Yeah, thank you, Nikki. I wanted to clarify a bit, going back to what is being negotiated within the UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. So what we have so far is a framework convention that addresses a general framework, sorry for the redundancy, that will address how states cooperate towards fair tax system at the international level. So for instance, it would help address illicit financial flows between states, for instance, by sharing effective tax information between tax agencies. And at the same time, beyond this general framework that establishes general obligations and principles, and also addresses the institutional look of what this framework convention would look like, there are already 2 additional protocols that are being negotiated. One is on transboundary digital systems, and the other is on settlement mechanisms. And of course, because this is a framework convention, there could be potential additional protocols that could be negotiated from now till 2027, but also onwards once the text of the Framework Convention is adopted. Within the topics that have already been discussed as potential additional issues to be addressed within the framework and the additional protocols, there are issues related to the fiscal measures related to multinational enterprises, and also related to taxing the ultra-rich. So although so far there is no global tax specific substantive measures being discussed, there is the potential for those type of specific measures being addressed through substantive protocols that could be negotiated in the upcoming years. So this will look very similar to the UNFCCC in the sense that it will be a framework convention, and there could be potential for additional protocols being discussed in the coming years.
Thank you, Magdalena. And I think, it's quite useful to get involved with the negotiations, with the UN Tax Convention negotiations now, because we have, better opportunities, to follow that process closely, but also to link these different processes we were speaking about. And in that regard, there are several questions regarding the G20 and how can civil society, participate in that space, and also how can we push, for more discussions on the international financial architecture reform. So I don't know, Delaney, if you want to come in on that one.
Yeah, sure. It's a difficult one given how volatile the environment is at the moment. But I would say a good way, we should remember that the financial architecture is not just composed by the big multilateral development banks, nor just that venue is the only way to engage with the reform agenda. I think what's interesting, and might be also interesting this year, is how those smaller, more nimble regional development banks, especially in Latin America, might have a bigger role to play going forward. And I think engaging with them would be very useful. They pretty much are looking at what happened in the financial architecture agenda. They understand better what their clients at the regional level need. And they are still pretty new, at least on climate, on how to merge climate and development. And they probably will have big questions to answer for their own membership in terms of how to manage this volatile environment as well, what to do in terms of revenues. I think that's where I feel that national regional element has been forgotten as well. I think someone mentioned, I think it was Rebecca, like national policy, regional policy still matters a lot. So do not think that, because I don't want to discourage people from engaging with G20, but also remembering there are other venues too where you might have a lot of access and still create that foundation then could eventually also influence global policies as well.
Thank you, Delaney. And I think, at least from a personal note, I think not everything's lost. I think we need to keep pushing particularly for multilateralism. I think, we are again in a very difficult context. And there's one question that touches upon this and that mentions, that again, with Trump's politics, and that he has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, and they also have a very important role in MDBs. Again, they are very relevant for the international financial architecture reform discussions, but also there's a question regarding China, and what's their link or what's their role, particularly in terms of climate finance? So Jose, you mentioned, this confrontation between the US and China in the international system. So do you have further reflections on that?
Yes, of course. During last years, China has become a leader in clean energy, and it has occupied leadership in climate finance leadership when the United States abandoned the processes after Copenhagen in 2009. So we are talking about history, but we could see that China has been involving its participation and its compromises within the climate finance framework, we could say, during the last years. So it's predictable that China will be fostering its role in climate finances during next years. And it's important to note too that if we assume an expansive definition of climate finance, and we consider all flows of all financial flows oriented to the financing of climate projects, we must assume that China is occupying leadership in this extended definition. If we consider the climate financing. And in this regard, it is important to note that China has increased during last years its budget oriented to climate finance.
Thank you, Jose, for that. So we are coming to an end. There are still a lot of questions, but I wanted to give 1 minute to each of our panelists to kind of make some final reflections. So we will go in order, and let's start with Rebecca, if you have any additional comments.
No, I don't have anything brilliant to add. Just I think the type of conversation we are having today is critical in the current context. So really thank you, GFLAC and Redfish to have created this space. Because I don't think that it's through those conversation, reflection, and maybe sometimes, challenging remarks that we can actually build stronger synergies across different areas of work and make change happen. Maybe not in the most visible way in the coming months and year because of the current context, but taking time to reflect, assess, and then build change from maybe the ground up would probably be something that we all need to collectively do. So I really appreciate the discussion and the strategic reflection that I will keep with me for the coming weeks and months. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Now over to Mariana.
Thank you. I guess sometimes when I look at the COP processes, we might think they're too slow, there are too many challenges, and what other solutions. But in fact, with all those challenges, it's one of the very few spaces where the Global South has equal voice and participation as Global North countries. So it's really essential when you think about a space to discuss climate finance that actually might meet the needs of the developing countries of the Global South. This is the best avenue to go. Because when we look at through all the other spaces, the international financial institutions, etc., they are governed by global North and their interests and their geopolitics. And after Mark Carney's speech in Davos, in terms of, all the threats to multilateralism, more than ever, it's really important to think about what are the democratic institutions that can really drive the interests and the agendas of the Global South. And the COP, for all its challenges, is still the best space where you can move that agenda forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Mariana. Now over to Maya.
Well, I don't have a lot of things to add, but just thank you. Thanks for inviting me and for providing space to discuss these important issues, and hope everyone has, after today, thinking and working on ways on how we can still be working to sustain some of these initiatives, and I would say something is more on principles, but at least what we are trying to do is reform the international financial architecture and have a fairer, just to make it fair for developing economies, for the Global South. So anything that we can do together, I think in this challenging context, this should be the era of coordination at some point, and finding different networks and alliances is key. So I will leave with that message to all of you.
Thank you for that positive end note. Magdalena?
I think the last message that I want to leave here is that the UN Tax Convention is not an isolated technical tax discussion, but rather that is the infrastructure, the financial cooperation infrastructure that we need to address the climate finance gap that could enable effective transfers of resources from north to south. So to make that aware to everyone here, and to remember that it's still taking place up until 2027, and that we then need to push our states to actually be part of that convention.
Thank you, Magdalena. Over to Delaney.
Yeah, no, I would like to reinforce the point around dialogues. I think it's going to be really, really important that in an era where we're seeing a lot of places and venues being closed, that we still keep talking to each other. That we still remember that what's the final objective that we're pursuing, and find tactics and strategize together on how to achieve those. I think the other element is around the technical elements will still move. That the conversations, like Magdalena is saying, technical will keep moving, or not only technical, but also, so how do we sustain that? And how do we translate that to a more political, when the time is right, or start creating those spaces? And yeah, how do we keep all these conversations that bring together that the MDB's reform, what happens in FCCC, the tax convention, the UN Convention on Tax, so all of this together, because I think there might be a temptation to just go into one or two things and forget about the rest. So we probably need to have a double track when it comes to our approach. Thank you, Nicole. On jet lag.
Thank you, Delaney. And now we have Jose to hopefully also finish on a positive note.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicole, to all my colleagues here, for this opportunity to connect dots and consider different dimension of climate finance, and think about the possibilities of this year. It's important not to leave this conversation, the first of the year, with a pessimist view, but consider that we have a lot of work to do in this year and in the following one. And three messages that I would like to give as final remarks is to support multilateralism, of course, as you might said Nicole previously, reinforce our compromise as part of Global South activist that is to negotiate for more climate finance, considering it as public, predictable, and the last one is to reduce the cost of capital in general terms in order to facilitate the consolidation of the Article 2.1.1c. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose, and thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to those who speak Spanish and have, go or done an effort to speak in English. We also hold webinars and workshops in Spanish, just to let everyone know, and we will be doing so in this year as well. But again, if you want to see the recording of this webinar, you can do so in GFLAG's YouTube channel. We'll also be sharing a summary of this webinar to those who registered for the webinar. So thank you once again to all our panelists and for those of you who were able to join through Zoom and YouTube as well. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.